think the rest will join us in a minute, but let's start our next session. Our session will be about the civil service pay and rewards, and of course, compensation model is a continuous debate in the civil service. Of course, the notion of compensating for the opportunity cost of the civil service of individuals not joining the private sector is a big debate. In many countries, there is an effort to really make the salaries of civil service comparable to the private sector. But on the other hand, is it really sustainable? We know that in Singapore, for instance, in the senior executive service called administrative service, 70% of the top civil servants are pegged to private sector best positions. So it's not 100% pegged to the private sector level, but only to 70%. So it is important to maintain a delicate balance. I remember when I spent 2 years in Singapore, we would receive lectures from Lee Kuan Yew himself, the founder of Singapore, modern Singapore, who used to always say that we, in civil service, we don't want the pay to be the reason why people want to join the civil service. But we also don't want the pay to be the reason why people want to leave the civil service. So it is about the delicate balance. So Astana Civil Service Hub, together with the global UNDP Global Center for Public Service Excellence in Singapore, a couple of years ago conducted a research paper on public service motivation in Kazakhstan and Pakistan, which shows that in Kazakhstan, apparently, civil servants demonstrate higher intrinsic motivation, which is non-monetary, compared to public servants in other Asian countries, which is really interesting. The case is actually printed out, available for your attention outside, I think, on the tables. This also brings to another point that I wanted to mention. I'm managing the Center for Strategic Initiative, which is a private consulting firm in Kazakhstan. We focus on strategic consulting. So recently we helped the Astana city government to transform its operational model, where we consulted the mayor not only to come up with a new organizational design, but also to implement the new salary scheme of civil servants in Kazakhstan. So the salaries of the provincial level, the Astana city level of the civil servants has been increased twofold, which is a significant motivation in terms of monetary compensation. But now the question is whether civil servants in Astana City Council are motivated intrinsically. So that is the essence of the transformation that we try to contribute to, and we feel privileged to be part of this transformation in Astana, which is still ongoing. Now, without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to our first speaker, Panos Liverakos, our international consultant of the Astana Civil Service Hub, who will talk about the trends in civil service remuneration and non-monetary rewards. So Panos, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Yernar. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Before I start, I'd like to make a comment. Lesson learned. Never again accept to be in the last session of the first day. Having said that, I'd like to say that for that reason, I respect the time limit, and therefore I will actually go, I will skip through some of the slides in the beginning, which are mostly background, and I will go to the essence of these remuneration systems around the world. This comparative study is work in progress of the Astana Civil Service Hub research team. It is expected that the study will be completed by the end of the current year and subsequently published. It is an interesting topic, and as there is not much research on the subject, it is also very hard to obtain disaggregated data. The presentation starts with an overview of public sector pay around the world, and this is the part I will skip through very fast. It goes on with an overview of the public sector compensation components, and it concludes with some trends identified on public sector pay practices around the world. The public sector compensation consists of various components. Some are tangible and some are intangible. Some concern the individual and others are collective. They concern the group. This is illustrated through the OECD proposed classification of the total compensation package that you see on these slides. The existing data sets of public sector compensation data, which are usually provided by international organizations, the IMF, the ILO, the World Bank, mostly include the tangible components. Thus, they usually underestimate the total cost, as such intangible components like training, accommodation, etc. are missing. Ideally, all components should be included in order to properly account for the total cost of public sector compensation to the state budget. Quick information. This slide presents the size of the public sector as percentage of the GDP across some groupings around the world. What I will just mention quickly, that overall it represents 6.3% of GDP on average. There are differences, like in LICs, in low-income countries, the cost is about 5.2, in MICs, middle-income countries, 7.3, and in high-income countries, 6.1. As a percentage of government expenditure, what we see here is that overall it seems that about 25% of government expenditure is devoted to the wage bill of the public sector worldwide. What is interesting in this case is that it's the LICs that spend the highest proportion of the expenditure, 28-something%, and followed by the MICs, 27%, and with the high income at 20.4%. In the case of revenues, again, the average is about 23.7%. The pattern persists in the case of LICs, MICs, and HICs, and you can see the percentages on the slide there. By income level, I think this is a bit more interesting. It seems that high income countries spend roughly the same percentage of revenues and expenditures for the central government employees' compensation, about 20% of revenues, etc. The gap becomes larger in the case of the MICs and even larger in the case of the LICs. There are some explanations for that. We can actually go through them during the discussion, if there is time for that. Here is a kind of a composite presentation with a limited number of countries where it actually shows you the relationship between the percentage as percentage of GDP, percentage of revenues, a percentage of expenditures. This ratio can be helpful, what you see here, in assessing whether employment is adequate or excessively generous relatively to what is needed to provide essential services to the population. It is evident that the higher the income of a country, the higher the percentage of people employed in the public sector. As you can see, public sector employment in high-income countries is 10%, 6% in middle income, and 1% the LICs. This is partly due to the fact that income countries, higher income countries tend to provide more public services than lower income countries. This could also be an indicator, a part of a solution to what the gentleman from Montenegro mentioned earlier on. How do you determine the size of your public sector? So it also depends on the size of the wealth of the country. Now, I also included some information of a selective number of countries in the region. The selected countries are not an arbitrary choice. It was driven by availability of data. and it was not a deliberate choice. It would be ideal to include all countries in the region. On average, these 9 countries spent 4.3% of their GDP on central government compensation. It seems that Mongolia has the highest rate and Kazakhstan the lowest. A word of caution here. At this point, it is not entirely clear which public employees are included in the study. So such percentages may be under or overestimated. So comments from the audience, if you do have some experience on this, would be very welcome. A similar pattern emerges here. I will not delve too much on this. You can see on the slide what is the percentage of government expenditures in those 9 countries. And the same applies for the case of revenues for those countries. You can see that there is a lot of congruence between the percentage of GDP revenues and expenditures in all these countries. And here is some information on the size of the public sector as percentage of the total population. As you can see, Belarus employs 48% of its population in the state sector, and this is for the whole state sector. And if you see the breakdown, of course, the state employees are much less. Now, compression ratio. This is something I would like to spend a little bit more on. Compression ratio is defined as a differential between the highest and lowest paid employees in the public sector. The OECD has a slightly different definition, and I tend to agree with it, is because it considers the compression ratio as the difference between the median pay of the top 10% and bottom 10% of all earners. And this is understandable because if you do compare it using median, then you avoid skewing of the overall ratio if a couple of outliers are included in the sample. On the other hand, compression ratio is a useful indicator of the adequacy of pay. However, lower ratios suggest that highly skilled workers are underpaid while unskilled workers are overpaid. And I think Rex will actually talk more about this because it also has to do with the entry-level pay. This has a relationship with the entry-level pay also in comparison to people at the top of the hierarchy. A couple of other issues worth pointing out about the compression ratio. There is no uniformity in what is treated as making up employees' pay. More often than not, it's equated with wages only. In other cases, it includes all forms of allowances. For instance, an example here, Uganda found that its compression ratio, it was 6.8 to 1. When it included non-monetary allowances and benefits, the ratio changed to 100 against 1. Another observation or a caution to keep in mind is that cross-country comparisons may contain considerable bias, as existing data is not entirely comparable, since what constitutes the civil service public sector differs from country to country. And this is also corroborated with the presentation that Daniel made earlier on and sparked my question. We're not very sure what is included in each country in what we consider civil service or public sector, etc. Now, the perennial question, what is a fair compression ratio? The IMF recommended for Eastern Europe in the 1990s 7 to 1. However, if you look at other surveys of the IMF, through their studies and through their research, they found that there were ratios that ranged from 1.5 to 1 to 33 to 1. Now, this is examples compared against the OECD. As you can see, the average in the OECD countries stands at 4.39%. But in a sense, it indicates that a more equitable public sector compression ratio is about that, if we were to consider, take into consideration the comment I made earlier on. But then you can see the differences that exist in other countries compared to the OECD. For example, look at Mexico. You know, it's an outlier in this case, over 10.2, or Italy at 7. And yet there are other countries like Norway where this ratio is much lower, or the Netherlands. Oh, what is going on with this? Sorry, I'm sorry. Can you please? The compensation comparisons, public versus private sector. Again, you can see on the slide that the average base salary difference in some countries are the following. In the UK, the public sector pays 13% below the general market. In Singapore, it's 2% above the general market. In the USA, about 6%, and perhaps Rex can corroborate that. In the United Arab Emirates, it's 15%. And in the case of Canada, it's 1% the general market. Future directions. Overall, fiscal constraints on government budgets are forcing governments to rethink the ways they compensate their employees, as well as how the rewards for it are organized and managed. However, government compensation schemes and systems have started changing after decades of little or incremental or no change at all. Developments to date suggest no single good practice model has emerged. An OECD review in 2012 revealed that there is no single recipe answer to the design and administration of government employee compensation schemes. The mix and balance of the components of total compensation differ significantly from country to country. This variation is expected as the structure and composition of each country's public sector compensation system is rooted in the uniqueness of each country in terms of history, culture, and political, economic, and social circumstances. Several reform measures have been implemented to rationalize government spending on public sector compensation. And you see some examples. I'll say a couple of words for each one of them. Ad hoc wage adjustments, where the nominal salary is just adjusted below inflation, and it's cut in real terms. A typical case of the measure is an across-the-board wage freeze. This choice may potentially have a negative impact on attracting talented individuals to the civil service. Another measure is introduction of structural pay policies, which aim to align wages with job requirements and performance levels. Kazakhstan is currently working on such project. Attrition-based employment reduction, through which recruitment for vacated positions is restricted. Under a typical attrition rule of X versus Y, only X out of Y positions are filled. For example, in Greece, the government can only recruit one new employee for every 5 that leave the public service through retirement or otherwise. Targeted employment reduction, through which public sector employment is reduced by voluntary or involuntary separation or early retirement schemes offered on a targeted basis. This measure has been extensively used by state-owned enterprises, especially in cases that they would be prepared to be transferred to the private sector. Public sector restructuring is another way, which usually begins with a functional review of the public sector, followed by mergers of government units, process re-engineering, outsourcing, or other measures to reduce public employment. Centralization of human resources management in order to track all public sector workers and have full control over their payroll. This measure, again, was implemented in Greece from 2013, that led to knowing, for the first time in history, the exact number of public sector employees for the first time. It also helped in streamlining public compensation, as the census conducted at the beginning of implementation identified ghost workers and double-paid individuals. Streamlining bonuses and allowances by tightening eligibility and reducing the number of allowances the civil servants receive. Reduce or eliminate the 13th salary prevalent in a number of countries. For example, Hungary eliminated the 13th salary in the late 2009. In early 2010, Greece, due to the economic and fiscal crisis, eliminated the 13th and 14th salaries public employees were getting and replaced them with a fixed bonus at a lower level. Furthermore, all allowances were cut across the board by 10%. Another way is inclusion of non-monetary rewards in the compensation package of public employees, which, when it's expressed in monetary terms, it makes them part of their taxable income, therefore reducing the disposable income and increasing the revenues of the state. Substitute overtime with leave time. Substitute monetary compensation for overtime with leave time, or suspend the premium paid on the hourly wage rate for overtime. And last, or another way, is extending working hours of public employees, especially in cases where they work less than 8-hour shifts. Again, unfortunately, I use Greece as an example. Teachers who used to spend 6 hours per day at work, they are now required to work for 8. Other trends. Another trend in compensation management is delegation of responsibility from a central office to agencies and ministries. In a few countries, responsibility for managing salaries is delegated to line managers and supervisors. However, a prerequisite for this system to work must be already in place. That is a system that holds executives and managers accountable for the performance of their units and their budgets. Individualized pay is another trend. With knowledge jobs on the rise, employers are introducing pay policies that recognize the value of better qualified workers with higher salaries. Occupations that are high in demand, such as those in technology and healthcare, command higher starting salaries. In this context, the challenge for governments is that they remain competitive by being flexible in modifying their compensation programs to meet the differentials in pay offered by the private sector. In other words, the individualization of wage determination allows governments to have flexibility in pay, to differentiate scales, and to provide additional allowances to attract and retain staff, especially in areas with skill shortages. Allowances need to be linked, of course, to a coherent strategy for attracting needed skills and used appropriately to prevent growth. Nearly 60%, that's another trend, of the countries that have been surveyed have special allowances, and over 35% have separate pay scales for certain professions, for example, doctors and other sectors that they're in demand. The transition to performance-related pay is another trend, continues despite the problems that have arisen, and the fact that few countries claim to have fully made a success of this practice. With the current focus on government performance, there is a great possibility for this trend to continue. And other trend, and I think this is almost my last one, is a rather politically sensitive one, is executive compensation. And again, I think Rex will elaborate on that. The public sector is known to have executive compensation below the levels in the private sector. But the fact that pay levels are significantly higher, that makes it difficult for the average citizen to understand and build support for those levels. Performance-related pay is another trend, at least in the senior civil service. It plays a larger role there. However, even in this case, the awards for public sector executives are much smaller than the private sector, although they still look very large for the public. So it may be politically difficult to actually implement them. And I stop here. I just wanted to show you two last slides on the degree of delegation of responsibility. I think this may coincide a lot also with the findings that Daniel showed earlier on in his benchmarking. And I'm glad to see that our information is rather correlated and there are not many contradictions. And here it shows you the use of performance-related pay in various countries with the OECD average at the end standing at 0.7%. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Panos. Now I would like to give the floor to Rex Facer, Associate Professor of Public Finance and Management, Romney Institute of Public Management, Brigham Young University, USA. He will talk about the U.S. federal salary scheme. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yarnar, and it's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. And my goal is to try and give you enough of an overview of the U.S. compensation system so that you at least have some working understanding, and we then can have some more engaged conversation. Unfortunately, I won't have time to give you all of the details. And there are a couple of reasons for this, and let me just start here. So I'm going to talk about the civil service systems, and I use the word systems in the U.S. explicitly, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then we'll talk about some basic compensation structures, and then we'll spend the bulk of our time, which won't be a lot of time, but we'll spend that on the federal compensation system, and then we'll conclude with a few challenges. So first of all, in the U.S., we do not have a single uniform civil service system. We have a variety of civil service systems. For example, we have about 90,000 local governments. Now, these may be cities, they may be counties, they may be special purpose governments, but almost every one of those has their own unique compensation system. So as a result, we don't have very much broad understanding and good research around what those compensation practices are at the local level. And then at the state level, we've got 50 systems, and maybe 50 plus one if you include Washington, D.C., whether you want to treat it as a county or if you want to treat it as a state. It's also a different animal. And so where we tend to spend a little more attention is on the federal system, where we kind of have one system. But even that one system has multiple parts, and it's still a bit chaotic. Just to give you some sense of the size and the magnitude of employment, in local governments, we have about 10.7 million full-time employees and about another 3.3 million part-time employees. That makes up for a total payroll of about $55 billion. And that's at the local level. That's a lot of money, and it's a place where we ought to be paying more attention. But because of the magnitude of how many there are, it's tough to spend a lot of time there. State government, not nearly as large, but still very substantial, about 3.8 million employees, full-time employees, and about another 1.6 million part-time employees. Their payroll is only about $22 billion, so quite a bit less than the $50+ billion of local governments. The federal government, on the other hand, they only have about 2.6 million full-time employees and only about another 500,000 part-time employees. Their payroll is only about $16 billion. Now, I say only, right? I mean, that's still a very big number. But a couple of notes, that little chart there on the side, which is probably a little difficult to see, shows the number of federal government employees over time in the executive branch. Now, you'll notice that I say there are 2.6 million full-time employees. That's all U.S. government employees, excluding soldiers in the military. But the red line only includes those that are in the executive department. So it doesn't include any legislative employees, any judicial employees, et cetera. And so that's where that gap it rests. So in the executive civil service, we have basically three core pay systems. The first one is what we call the federal wage system. Those are for hourly, tend to be blue-collar kinds of jobs, right? An example might be mechanics. That would be an example of somebody that's in the federal wage. But that only makes up about 250,000 employees, give or take. The general schedule, that's the one that we're most familiar with. That accounts for about 70% of federal employees. Those are the typical white-collar, typical federal bureaucrats that we think of, whether that be kind of administrative assistants or whether that be more professional roles as analysts or attorneys, all of that. And then the third broad category is the senior executive service, which we've had reference to with respect to the similarities with the Core A and other efforts of that higher level. Now, the Senior Executive Service was created in 1978 as part of the Civil Service Reform Act, and the idea was we're going to take a group of high-level professionals, we're going to train them so that they can then move around the federal government and use their expertise to make things better. It's worked some and hasn't worked some. And so while I think there is some real value in having that additional level that allows us to compensate some very senior executives at more appropriate levels, it still, in practice, is a difficult thing to do. But a couple of things. So I'm going to focus on the general schedule. Now, it was put into place in 1949. And it has not had a major change since then. Now, there have been lots of minor changes, but as we heard earlier, the nature of work has changed dramatically since the 1950s, right? And so one of the challenges we have is making sure that we're keeping up our ability to analyze and compare jobs in ways that make sense in today's greater knowledge economy. Now, we have made changes in the strategies we use to analyze jobs, but that broad structure has remained the same. Now, there are some people who want to throw that broad structure out. I'm not necessarily one of those. I think that the underlying structure can still be used productively, but how you get to that structure is where the rubber meets the road, and that's where we have to think carefully, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, the way jobs are evaluated, we use what's called a point factor system, which is very common. It's used in private sector firms. It's used all around the world. There are a number of different providers. One of the most common is the Hay Group, and they do a lot of work around the world. The federal government has their own point factor system that they have developed. We use a variation of that when we do work with local governments. And we still find it to be a very useful and productive strategy in helping us understand and differentiate what makes a job unique or different, and how do we then compare jobs that are different to make sure we're getting similar, appropriate kinds of compensation. Jobs then, based on that point factor evaluation, are compared and then grouped together in clusters that have similar point scores. And then those grades are used to set compensation, and employees then progress through that grade over time. Now, in the U.S. federal system, now there are a couple of things. Panos mentioned the compression, and one of the big problems that we have with compression in the U.S. federal system is the range from the bottom of one grade to the top of that same grade is only 30%. Now, in private sector firms, we're much more likely to see we see them sometimes up to 75%, but it's much more common for us to see them in the 45 to 50% kind of range. It's very common. Now, so that's one of the issues that causes some of that compression. We've got very narrow ranges on those pay grades. The other thing that causes that compression is how we move through the steps. So in order to go from the bottom of your pay grade to the top of the pay grade, it's going to take you about 18 years. 18 years to move 30%. That is not that is not a lot of movement. And I'll show you a couple of charts just very quickly that highlights what those actual numbers are and how small, in many cases, those are. Now, the federal wage system is slightly different. Their grades only have 5 steps, for example. The senior executive service, they have 5 different pay levels. And so there are some differences, but what we pay most attention to is the general schedule. Let's see, we talked about position analysis. So in the US federal government, we do have, it's kind of hard because on the one hand, there is an element of performance pay in all of this, right? Because in order to make your step increase, you have to be evaluated on your performance appraisal as fully successful. And so if you don't meet that basic performance standard, then you don't get your increase. Now the problem is that too many managers are likely to give their employee fully successful even when they don't truly deserve that evaluation. And we can spend a whole day talking about performance appraisal issues, and unfortunately we don't have time to do that. But just note that it's going to take a long time for them to move through. Now, very quickly on local government pay system, so I'm going to jump over to local government for just a moment. They tend to be that same kind of point factor system. One of the big differences, they tend to have a lot more grades than the federal government does. The federal government only has 15. It's not uncommon for a local government to have 25 or 30 different grades. And their spread is much more similar to what we see in the private sector. They tend to be in the 40 to 50% range. So here's, we did some work for the city of Auburn, Alabama recently. They made some changes to their plan. So they're using a variation of a pay for performance system. And if they get their performance rating at a 3 or above, they're then eligible, and each step is a 3% increase over the previous step. And in steps 1 through 9, every year you advance a step. In years 10, 11, and 12, it takes 2 years to move through each step. And then in 13 and 14, you have to be 3 years in the previous step. And so, again, it's going to take you a fair amount of time, but the thing that makes it different is you're growing at a much more rapid pace than you are in the federal system. And so it will take them 20 years to make that roughly 50% range rather than a 30% range in 18 years. So I don't expect any of you to be able to read that. But what I want you to note here is, again, this is from Auburn, Alabama. And note that there are just a lot of numbers along here on the side, right? It goes down to 24 grades. And that's just to highlight that they're using a lot more grades than the federal government is. This is a close-up of one of those pay tables for grades 8 through 11. And again, you're starting out at, so here at grade 9, you're starting out at about $32,600. And it will go all the way up to $47,895. So it's about a 50% range that you can move through. So jumping back to the federal government. So one of the things that causes some of these compression problems that we have in the federal government is that entry level for people with a bachelor's degree tends to happen at around, oh, that's not very pretty. Now, these are the grades. Entry level with a bachelor's degree happens around grade 7. It's a very common entry level. And so that's one of the reasons you have this spike. So this is the total number of full-time equivalent employees by grade. The other place you get this spike is right here in grade 9. That's the entry level for people with master's degrees. And then 11, 12, and 15. So you'll notice that it's skewed somewhat to the right. Now, part of that's because in the federal government at the U.S., we have relatively high levels of education, and we have them in very high kind of responsible jobs. Now, some of that has been a result of our outsourcing and other things. Again, we can spend a lot of time talking about that. But what I want you to notice is on this next chart, this is the actual pay distribution, and you'll notice that it has a leftward shift, where the grade distribution had a rightward shift, the pay distribution has a leftward shift, so that most employees in the federal government, if I can push the right button, you can almost see the little red dot. Most employees in the federal government are making between $40,000 and this $80,000 or $90,000 kind of range. And so, now that's not a bad income, but it's not a robust income either, right? This is, you can feed a small family and take care of yourself and live a modest life. But you'll see that we've essentially got a fair amount of compression right there in this kind of lower middle income at the federal government level. This is what the federal blue-collar pay distribution looks like. So just very quickly, back in 1990, the Congress passed a law that said we want pay to be comparable between the federal employees and the private sector. Now, they said it, but they didn't really mean it. By policy, they said, well, we want them to be equal, but a 5% difference is equal. So they're targeting a 5% gap. Now, the bad news for federal government employees is the gap is a lot bigger than that, and they've never gotten anywhere close to that 5% gap. And so that's just saying that we want to close the gap, but we're going to pay attention to labor market costs. So it's not a cost of living, it's a labor market cost. And so I'm going to look at what it costs to hire an accountant in, say, San Francisco versus what it costs to hire an accountant in Omaha, Nebraska. And I'm going to guarantee you it's going to be much more expensive to hire an accountant in San Francisco than Omaha. And so they then created what they call these local pay areas, where they're looking at a local labor market, and that then allows the federal government to add to their pay to try and close that gap in those labor markets where the gap is exceptionally large. So the way we do that, and this is where we get some discrepancy between the number that Panos raised, where he said, there's some data that suggests there's about a 6% gap between the government employees and the private sector. That's developed using human capital modeling, which is a great tool for economists, and it gives us the ability to understand what are some of the components that may contribute to somebody's skill set, but it is a lousy way to set pay. Matter of fact, nobody uses it to set pay. And so when we set pay, what we like to do is we like to make comparisons to actual jobs, right? So if I'm going to be hiring an accountant and I want to know what the market for accountants is, I want to go out and ask, and I want to find an accountant who does the exact same kind of thing, and I want to use that to make my pay comparison. And so we use a methodology like that in the US. We do some surveys through the Bureau of Labor Statistics that send surveys out to private sector employers, ask a whole bunch of questions. They ask what your job is, then they ask a number of questions to help us identify what kinds of factors there are so we can get some estimate on kind of the level of work that's being done. And we're then able to backward map that onto the federal pay system so we can then make some comparisons. Now, are they perfect? No, but it's a very reasonable approximation. And when you're trying to do this across a nation that's as spread out as the United States and as large as the United States, you're either going to have to pay a huge amount of money to do all of these local comparisons, or you're going to have some level of statistical adjustment. And we've chosen the statistical adjustment process. So here's an example in Chicago. So in Chicago, we've got the 15 pay grades. Now, you'll notice that in grades 1 and 2, that there is not a gap reported. There were not enough people in those positions in the private sector for us to make a comparison. So we don't have that data. In grade 3, private sector employees are making on average about $32,000, where federal employees are making about $25,000. So in Chicago, there's about a 27% gap. Now, again, this is only on direct monetary compensation. It doesn't include anything around benefits. And I'll give you my quick benefit spiel now, because we may not have time otherwise. Benefits used to be one of the huge assets to federal government employment. That has eroded dramatically in the last 20 years. If you now look at other large employers, they're likely to have benefit packages that are much more rich than the federal government does. Now, the one place where we still see some differentiation is around the retirement benefit. The federal government's retirement benefit is still pretty attractive, but even that will be changing. I mean, the writing's on the wall that there will be changes moving forward. And so that's going to erode even further and weaken that benefit package. So now what I want you to really notice is when we get up here into grades 12, 13, and 14, notice the gap is about 70 or 80%. Okay? So what happens is the higher you're going up the scale, essentially people that have that advanced education, that are highly trained, they're making dramatically more in the private sector. And so if we're going to continue to have comparatively low wages in the federal government, then we're going to have some other set of non-monetary awards that are able to keep people connected. Now, it could be the kind of motivation that Yernar talked about. It could be a set of other benefits. But we've got to be thinking about that, because the reality is that we have about 60% of federal employees that are eligible to retire today. They could literally walk in and say, hey, you know what, we're done. And so if the federal government had to replace 60% of their workforce today, how many of our young millennials are going to be excited when they come in and say, hey, by the way, we're going to give you a great job and pay you 70% of what you could make in the private sector? Now, there are some people who are going to say, that's great, because I really care about being involved in public policy. I have that intrinsic motivation, right? But there are going to be an awful lot of good people that say, well, you know what? We have really interesting private firms today that have a social responsibility, and I'm willing to work for them, or I'm willing to work for a nonprofit that I believe in their cause. And so the federal government's going to have to grapple with this issue. Really quickly, this is the San Jose, San Francisco area. The gap is even worse. The average gap in San Francisco is about 99%, so you're being paid about half what somebody is in the private sector in San Francisco. Now, if you're in other parts of the country, we call those, it's a really technical term, we call it the rest of the U.S., right? So someplace it's not one of these places that have a really high differential. And basically that means that if you have a gap of less than 30%, you're going to be in this rest of the U.S. So the average gap in the rest of the U.S. is about 36%. But notice that for some of these, especially the lower grades, you're being paid pretty comparable, you're 15 to 10% off of what they are in the private sector. And there are some places where you're actually being paid more than they are in the private sector. But again, when you get up to these higher graded positions, you're making a third less than you are in the private sector. So this, again, creates some real challenges. Now, this graph that you can't read very well, this is after we try and correct for that gap. So what we do is we identify those places with a big gap. We then give a disproportionate amount where the gap is higher. So even when we correct for that gap, in a place like Washington, D.C., we still have a gap of about 50%. In San Jose, the gap is at 47%. And then when you get down to, I believe it's Cleveland and Cincinnati, the gap is down to about 20%. So we can make some real progress in some of these places where the gap is relatively modest. We're down to 20%. But you've still got a huge gap in places like D.C. Now, my economist friends say, that can't be real. You can't really have a gap of 50% in D.C. because what rational economic actor would choose to work for 50% less? Well, it's those rational actors that are using something other than just pay as their motivator. And so we've got lots of issues. So just to highlight, if you're in the U.S. federal government and say you're a GS7, that's that entry-level job for somebody with a bachelor's degree, you're going to start out making about $40,000. And over a 20-year career, roughly, if you stay in that same grade, you're going to be making about $53,000 by the time you make it all the way through the grade. Now, hopefully what will happen is you'll be able to get some promotions and move up some grades. But we are not talking about kind of really high levels of pay. But part of the problem, and Panos kind of hinted at this, when we start to get up in some of these higher levels, right, if you're a grade 13, you can get up to $111,000. Now, the problem is that newspapers every year publish an article. You can count on the USA Today every year publishing an article that lists the percentage of federal employees who now make over $100,000, right, and how much that has increased from one year to the next. And one of the things they always say is they show 20% more making over $100,000. Well, yeah, but that 20% is still a fairly small portion of the entire federal workforce, because you'll remember how that compensation graph was skewed down to the left. We're at a very small tail on those that are making up here in, especially in the $150,000 range. It just doesn't happen. Now, there are lots of challenges. This is, if you want to see it for San Jose, you can get all the way up to about $160,000. This is for, no, I can't see it. Oh, Chicago. Again, you can get up to about $160,000. So we've got some major issues going on, and I wish I had more time to talk in greater depth about this, but we've got to figure out how to deal with the less advantageous benefit packages. We've got to figure out how to deal with the pressure to reduce retirement benefits. It's a major issue. We're seeing places like Illinois that their retirement system is essentially bankrupting the state. And we've got to find ways to deal with that. Now, the U.S. federal government is fortunate enough to be in the position where they'll just continue to issue more debt. And this is where I make my Republican joke about, they don't care about debt anymore now that they're in power. But the other big deal that we've got to figure out is how do we deal with the pay compression, both from the high to the low, but also within grade. How are we going to deal with retirements, ongoing retirements? Most importantly, though, I think, and it's a theme that we've heard here, Yarnar mentioned it in the other session, how do we get people to think of HR in a much more strategic fashion so we can actually use our compensation conversations as a productive part of how we manage, as opposed to just saying, how do we deal with the crisis that we're dealing with? And lastly, this is all about attracting and retaining a highly qualified workforce. There's very clear evidence that countries that have, it's kind of counterintuitive, right? But countries that have a higher reliance on property tax revenues have greater levels of economic growth. Now, it's somewhat counterintuitive because we're saying places that have higher taxes, grow more. And you're like, wait, how can that be, right? Well, the reason that is because places that have stable income that grow over time are able to hire better public servants. And better public servants are able to provide higher quality services, which then allows that economy to grow in a stable and productive manner. When you rely on income streams that are very turbulent, great, I just hired 10 new police officers. The next year the economy drops, now I've got to fire 10 police officers. My city doesn't feel very safe when I have that kind of swing. And so if we want to provide high quality public services, we've got to figure out how to pay public servants. And if we're going to figure out how to pay public servants, we've got to figure out how we have the resources to be able to do that in a productive way. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of a very quick snapshot of kind of the federal government's compensation practices and a little bit about how things work in the local government. So thank you.
Thank you, Rex. Rex is also a member of this U.S. Federal Salary Council. So thank you so much. Until President
Trump kicked me off. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah. You need to get back to it.
I got a letter. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we have a lot to talk about that. Уважаемые коллеги, пожалуйста, вопросы. У нас есть возможность задать спикерам вопросы.
Thanks very much for the presentations. I have a question to Mr. Facer. So you talked about the pay scale and the grades that exist in the American civil service system. So I was wondering, in terms of the context of the motivation of the civil servants, if the manager, clearly sees that one of his colleagues is way ahead of others, and he really deserves promotion in terms of jumping from one scale, one grade to another grade without waiting for 56 weeks or 58 weeks. If there is any such opportunity within and flexibility within the American Civil Service, and how often do you use that?
Yeah, there are a couple of strategies that they can use. One of them is called a quality step increase. And so you have the ability to move somebody up a step sooner than they otherwise would have. So maybe you're a quarter of the way into the employee's new year, and they've just knocked something out of the park, right? They just did an amazing project. They've shown that they're head and shoulders above their colleagues. You can then get a quality step increase for them. For their next increase, that starts that clock again for the calendar. So you can't give them a quality step increase in, say, April, and then give them their regular increase in the next September. But it allows you to do that early. Now, there's some other pay exceptions that can be applied. Unfortunately, they don't get used very often. And I think part of it is, and I want to be careful how I say this, managers are lazy. Well, maybe I wasn't very careful. But that's part of the problem, is that in order to go through some of those extra strategies, the manager has to fill out more paperwork, has to go through an appeal process to do it, and they just go, that's too hard, I don't want to do it. And so they rely on the willingness of those public employees to have that intrinsic motivation to stick around. And so I wish they would use it more often. Now, could we have better flexibilities? Probably. But at least we have some that we can use.
And if I may, quick follow-up question to that. If during the annual review process, annual appraisal process, the manager sees that there are some issues with the performance of his employee, which needs to be addressed through trainings, increasing qualification. How effective this system is? Do you have one unique training system, or do you?
So it's not as effective as it should be, and unfortunately, that's very common across performance appraisal systems. But it can be very effective. If a manager is engaged, they can use that process. Now, good managers aren't going to wait until that performance appraisal, that formal date occurs, right? They're going to start engaging early on. So when you see something, you start having those conversations. Hey, John or Maria, we need to address this issue. You've been turning in your reports late. Let's get them corrected. But if they're still not meeting your expectations, then when that performance review comes around, they don't get a step increase because they fall below that criteria. And you then create all of a sudden my mind just went blank, but it's a strategy on how to get them back to where they need a performance improvement plan. And so we have strategies to address it.
Thank you. And the last question, Aziza, please.
Yeah, I have a question, because it seems like we had several times today the reference that the data may not be fully accurate because the way we calculate the civil servants or public servants can vary from country to country. For example, I spotted, like in the case of Kyrgyzstan, they actually are being restricted to increase the pay. That's at the moment is a huge problem, because on behalf of OECD, I was assessing Kyrgyzstan, and the Istanbul Action Plan recommendation was to increase the remuneration, but IMF told them that they cannot increase more than 5% of GDP, so they actually below 5% of GDP, that's for sure. And the question is, so where do we actually put the full stop? So the civil servants are the people who are, as we classically think, those who are working in the central ministries and governments, or we tend to talk more about public servants, and then we have the classic model as teachers, doctors, as well as police. In Uzbekistan right now, amid no civil service, the government for the first time thought that it would be great to develop the law. And we have at the moment two different points of view. My point of view that it should be starting with a very narrow definition of civil servants, because this is easier to pull off the ground, and also the nature of work may be different. The others are saying, no, 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 let's do everything at once, including the teachers, and basically it's going to be like Titanic, because it's like really, really, we talk about extremely massive state presence with a huge army of people. So my question is the following. Would you suggest that in the absence of one model for all countries, it still would make more reason to talk about civil servants as a classic model for ministries, state agencies, without state-owned enterprises and without teachers, doctors, and police? Or perhaps the trend is to include everybody, and then we're going to have like your figure more like 25%, right, or 30%, because this is, I believe, for Norway, for Canada, includes everybody else, including teachers and nurses and other people on a government payroll. That's the question. Whom do we include? Whom do we count?
So, okay, yeah, I was going to see if Panos wanted to answer that, and he says I get to. My quick reaction is I would rather start small. The literature on successful change management suggests that if you start with a small win and then you proceed from there, that you're going to be more likely to be successful. So I personally like the idea of let's figure out this one piece that's very manageable, and then once we get that sorted out, then we can expand it out to that broader set. However, there is, I think, a reasonable argument to be made for let's just try and do the whole thing, right? If we're trying to combat, say, corruption, and we know that this is going to be one of the tools that we use, is going to be a kind of system-wide reformatting of the compensation structure, then why not just kind of move as aggressively as we possibly can? Now, one argument on why not to do that is because it's easier to mess up when you're trying to move 40 different levers. But if I can focus on a few, so even given that argument, my tendency would be to let's do one part of it first. In somewhat, it's the kind of model that Kazakhstan is doing, right? We're doing a pilot program with the compensation adjustment. Now, what I would suggest is that we do this pilot program, we then evaluate it, we then make some changes, and then we move forward. So the problem is that we often, we pilot something, we do the small change, and then we don't spend enough time evaluating it, and we just then jump in. It doesn't make a difference. I mean, it's like, imagine you fill your bathtub up with water, and it's cold, right? So you test it, it's cold, and then you still jump in. That doesn't make any sense, right? And I guess unless you wanted a really cold bath. I don't like cold baths. So
Astana's okay, no problem.
And so, if we notice that something's not the way we want it, then let's make some adjustments. Let's add some hot water, and then once we got it working, then we can expand it. So again, my suggestion would be narrow, and then figure that out, and then go more broad.
Good, thank you. We have a couple of more questions.
I just want to
Panos, please.
say something to Aziza too. Logically speaking, there are fundamental differences between the civil servants and the street-level bureaucrats you discussed about, teachers, policemen, or whatever. So obviously the government has to actually find out what they really want, first of all, out of the civil servants. We heard a lot in Tashkent, we heard a lot here too. It's a different, quote-unquote, different breed, therefore it has to be treated differently, especially at this stage. Especially at the stage that you actually want new blood in this transition reform stage. So you deal with that. You can use models from around the world, most likely Korea-based models, because that's what they're thinking from what I understand. And then you can move on to the other side, your street-level bureaucrats, and again determine the kind of pay, using benchmarks from around the world. I think putting everybody in the same basket, it would be a great mistake, and it would also confuse matters. Just one element very quickly, different competencies are required. You are actually rating different competencies, you're rating different levels of responsibility, different abilities to work for. Teaching is very different than policy making in the Ministry of Energy or the Ministry of National Economy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Asil, please.
You have to answer the next question.
Agency for Civil Service of Kazakhstan.
Civil Service Affairs and Anti-Corruption. My name is Asel, and my question is to Professor Faisar. Could you tell us, please, which pay system U.S. Army and law enforcement agency employees are using?
So the military uses a fundamentally different pay system for the military. It's based on their rank, and so it's completely unrelated. Now, civilian employees who work for the military, they created a separate system for them, and then it didn't work very well. They tried to do some broadbanding and things, and one of the problems that we saw increased discrimination, especially against women and minorities. And so they then pulled back, and they're using something much more similar to the basic general schedule, although it's again slightly different, but it's that same kind of grade in step system now.
Is it open system or closed? I mean, can we see it on the website or something?
It's an open system that way. Matter of fact, one of the things that is very unique about public sector employment in the U.S. is that you can actually, for most government employees, look up the exact compensation of an employee. And so if you want to know how much an accountant makes for the federal government, you can go to a website and find it. Now, I don't remember it off the top of my head, but I actually keep the browser open, in part because my students sometimes say, well, how much will I make if I go and work for this agency or that? And I can pull it up. And I don't really, I would prefer not to know what the name of the person was, but that's been the strategy that we have employed in the U.S. I don't think that would work in most other places. So that level of openness is probably not quite. But you can usually find on most of these, you can see the grading system. You can see what those. So the tables are published every year. Everybody can look at them. So in that sense, they're generally open.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think these two young lady and gentleman, and then Joseph, I think you'll have the last question to pose. If we can have it brief. Thank you.
I'm a master's degree student of Academy of Public Administration under the President of Kazakhstan. I want to go back to the idea of laziness of managers and promoting outstanding servants, and about strategies. You mentioned that you have a strategy on performance improving. And I wanted to ask you, how do you think, is it applicable to apply talent management instrument to public service, which is more natural in private sector? And if we go to pay system, if we will pay them much more, will it raise some inequality in public sector as a whole?
So first response is yes, we can use some of the talent management kinds of strategies that we do see in the private sector. There's no inherent reason why we couldn't do that. What we need is those managers to be thinking in a more engaged way. And that comes from their supervisors as well, right? If their supervisor is expecting and holding them accountable for actually managing and engaging with their employees, then it's going to be much more likely to happen. But what tends to happen is from the very top of the organization, we're not holding people accountable. And so if we can increase that culture of accountability, then those performance management systems are going to be much more productive, and we're going to be able to use talent management strategies to keep people and to help people grow and develop. The other issue around paying at higher levels, there is not clear research that suggests that dramatically increasing pay is going to dramatically change public sector employees' behavior. Now, one of the reasons I think we ought to be increasing pay is because we ought to be compensating people fairly and appropriately, not necessarily because I'm trying to change their behavior. I want to be rewarding their behavior that they're already engaging in many cases. I mean, I think about, I teach public administration. I've always had a very high level of respect for public servants. But from the 7 years that I served on the Federal Salary Council and being working closely with these federal bureaucrats on a regular basis, my respect for them grew immensely. And I already had a high level of respect, right? These are people that are extremely dedicated to doing their job, doing it well, doing it quickly and efficiently. Now, are there lazy bureaucrats? I'm sure there are. But the reality is that most of them are trying to do their jobs and trying to do it well. And so for me, it's compensating them fairly. And that doesn't necessarily mean just radically increasing their pay, because I don't think for many of the people that are already in the public service that that's going to drive them. Now, as we saw from some of the research that came out of the Hub's work on comparing Pakistan and some of the other places, that we do see that there are cultures where that may have a greater impact than others. And so we've got to be careful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. One more question.
Hi. Thanks for the presentation. I'm a public policy student. So back a few weeks ago at the Astana Economic Forum, one of the speakers, he suggested that the government of Kazakhstan should actually decrease the number of government officials, employees, increase the salary, and optimize the government. What would be your thoughts on that? And that's particularly interesting for me because, hopefully in a year I will graduate and will be looking, for my options either to join the government or to go to the public sector. And should I, start developing my, I guess, intrinsic values?
In some ways, that's the venture capital model of government, right? We take over the organization, we reduce the number of employees, we can then increase wages. It's not necessarily very effective. Now that works in the private sector, because you're going to essentially raid that organization and you don't care about its long-term viability, right? But in the public sector, we care about being able to provide those services over the long term. And so if those employees were critical to be able to provide those services, then getting rid of them is not going to, so if I just say, well, I'm going to cut the employees by half and I'm going to increase your pay by double, if you're already overworked, you're not going to be able to get more done, right? And so now, might there be efficiencies that we could gain? Sure, and we heard that discussed in some of the conversations around disruptive technology and things. But the reality is that when we have those disruptive technologies, often what we're hoping, especially in the public sector, is that then allows us to reallocate resources to more productive uses rather than completely getting rid of resources and making it so the government isn't able to function productively. So I'm not a big fan of that strategy. Now, am I a fan of paying public servants fairly and appropriately? Yeah, I would love to see public servants get double their pay. But I don't want to see that if what happens is that services actually go down. See, it turns out that, and we've been doing this research for 40 years, looking at the efficiency of governments. I did my dissertation research comparing public and private organizations, and my favorite quote that I had came out of the electric industry, because in the electric industry we have government-owned electric operations, we have privately owned electric operations, and my favorite line is, government and business electric operations are equally inefficient. So government doesn't own the corner on the market of inefficiencies. There are a lot of inefficiencies in the private sector. We just look the other way on those inefficiencies.
Great, thank you, Rex. I think we have the last question. Can we have it brief? And
Good afternoon. Yeah, so very brief, don't worry. My name is Joseph Tam, and I'm a Deputy Director at the National School of Public Policy. I have a question about Mr. Panos' slide. If you just pull up your slides, please. I have a question about your slide. Yeah. Okay, so any one of them. So it's a bit of a technical question, so it's more like a clarification. It seems to me that implicit somewhere in there you have maybe a causal logic model, I think. I could be wrong, and please correct me. And if you do have a logic model and you're trying to make a causal statement, can you just tell me something about the statistical tests you are using? Because I'm a little bit confused. I don't see any statistical testing, because you made all these statements that sound causal in some sense. And I don't think is, again, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not so good in statistics, whether it's okay to make the statements you made without some statistical, what's it called? Somebody help me here. Somebody help me here. You know, because you're making all these statements based on this one, but I don't see any statistical support. Thank you.
Basically, what I presented is descriptive statistics that were drawn from data sets of the IMF, the ILO, and the World Bank. And the reasoning was just to give a very general picture, because I said the study is very preliminary, of where the situation stands. Nothing more, nothing less, no causality. Causality will come in the second part of our study when we begin to think very seriously what to publish and how to publish.
My apologies, my apologies.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank Panos and Rex for the insightful presentation, and as well as the audience for the genuine interests and very excellent questions. With this, we close the session. We ran out of time. Уважаемые коллеги, с удовольствием я хотел предоставить слово председателю управляющего комитета регионального хаба в сфере государственной службы в Астане Александру Мухамедовичу. Пожалуйста. Для подведения итогов дня. Спасибо.
Я говорю Паносу, каково сейчас быть последним, выступающим последней сессии еще. Я прошу не пугаться, что у меня вот так много бумаг. Я просто вот этой пачкой бумаг хотел похвалить, иметь возможность похвалить аппарат хаба, потому что они вот здесь суммировали все, что было сказано с утра. И они попросили меня прокомментировать каждое выступление, что заняло бы еще 2 часа, наверное, времени. Поэтому, но это показывает реальности, что они добросовестно работают. И я хочу здесь вспомнить одного уникального человека. С 1931 года, с 1931 года по 1988 год непрерывно в одном аппарате советского правительства работал один человек, который последние 25 лет, 1964-го, возглавлял этот аппарат. Его фамилия Смертюков. И вот он пишет, так как он работал так долго, он сравнивал всех премьер-министров. И он говорит, вот Молотов был такой эффективный менеджер, что когда он председательствовал, к концу заседания уже готовые решения правительства приносили на подпись. И до сих пор у нас, как правило, после голосования еще иногда неделя проходит, прежде чем подписать. И вот он ну, такой пример, да? Но он говорит, однажды Молотов был в командировке, и Сталин председательствовал, я, говорит, как обычно, принес ему на подпись. Вот эту бумагу он подписал, я забрал, смотрю, нет подписи. Птичка стоит. Я, говорит, подошел, сказал, у нас такой порядок в правительстве, кто председательствует, тот подписывает. Он говорит, ты птичку видишь? Вот передай Молотову, пусть подпишет. Я хотел бы поблагодарить всех выступающих, всех вас за участие, за такую верность профессии, можно сказать, что вы до конца здесь находитесь. И, наверное, это благодаря тому, что все спикеры были сегодня прекрасны. Я хочу от имени всех участников, от имени организаторов поблагодарить всех спикеров за прекрасные, глубокие, информативные выступления. Несомненно, Они помогут нам скорректировать наши планы наравне с Needs Assessment Survey и вашими комментариями. Я люблю обычно сравнивать госуправление с футболом. Потому что на самом деле абсолютное большинство мужчин думают, что они разбираются в футболе. То же самое большинство мужчин думают, что все они разбираются в государственном управлении, в государственной службе. Но я сейчас, вот, касательно именно тематики даже этой сессии, недавно нашел интересную информацию. Прочитал. Вот сейчас будет скоро чемпионат мира, и в сборной России новый тренер, 2 года, Черчесов. Там привели статистику, а как выплачивались бонусы при нем. И он установил, оказывается, систему, что независимо от того, он выходил на поле, не выходил, забивал гол, не забивал, выиграл $15 000, ничья каждому по $7 000, проиграли ничего. И вот я когда performance-related бонусы или performance-related там зарплаты, я думаю иногда, наверное, если мы хотим, чтобы департамент или министерство работали как одна команда на один результат, наверное, бонусы тогда должны платиться всем одинаково. Потому что можем ли мы сказать, что эффективность аналитика не зависит от его соседа? Влияет ли работа коллег друг на друга? Вот это интересно. Мне кажется, об этом можно задуматься. Либо второе. Вы знаете, вот великий тренер, великий игрок, великий тренер Зидан сейчас ушел с Реала. И вот когда он пришел в Реал, оказывается, он дал на аутсорсинг анализ действий своих футболистов. Внутри команды бывают любимчики, бывают нелюбимые. И аутсорсинг, компьютерный анализ. Я подумал, на самом деле, аналитические функции тоже могут быть отданы в конкурентную среду. Потому что тогда, может быть, мы получим более беспристрастно, насколько этому готовы. И вот я все темы не буду касаться. Вот коллега из Армении задавал вопрос о сравнении очень сложной, невозможной сравнить зарплату государственного сектора и частного сектора, и HR-политику. Но я вспомнил, вот, кстати, к нам присоединился после обеда наш уважаемый друг и стратегический партнер хаба господин Шигео Кацу, президент Назарбаев университета. Он когда-то работал вице-президентом Всемирного банка. И лет 10 назад у меня была интересная дискуссия. Один из вице-президентов Всемирного банка, представляющий Францию, по-моему, и профессор из Соединенных Штатов. И у нас была дискуссия о том, если взять всю рабочую силу, каково место вот, по качеству, если брать госслужащих, корпуса госслужащих, в середине, ниже, выше. И мы пришли к выводу, они больше о своих странах говорили, что пришли к выводу они вместе, что в Соединенных Штатах это ниже середины, во Франции это выше середины. То есть это зависит еще, мне кажется, от того, какая социально-экономическая модель в целом выбрана страной и каково место госаппарата в этой модели. И иногда, мне кажется, некоторые госорганы как часть политики занятости создаются и не сокращаются, так же, как государственные структуры. Ну и, наконец, мне кажется, очень часто вот в вопросах оплаты труда, особенно связанных с результативностью, восстает традиционный вопрос курицы и яйца. Вот если мы хотим создать систему, где оплата связана с оценкой, должны ли мы сначала создать оценку, которая позволяет нормально избегать субъективности, либо мы сначала должны внедрить новую систему оплаты, а потом посмотреть, как вот будет, зависит. И, наконец, мне кажется, сама система оплаты влияет на управление человеческими ресурсами. Вот сейчас идут дискуссии, например, если мы считаем, что во всех госорганах HR-функции – это вспомогательная функция, И если мы будем считать, что они должны оплачиваться ниже, чем специалисты соответствующих отраслей, будет ли это приводить к улучшению работы министерств? На мой взгляд, нет, потому что мы же сейчас понимаем, что очень многое зависит от того, кого отобрали, чтобы он правильно использовал и инновации, и другое. Поэтому очень сложные вопросы, и мне кажется, мы получили очень большую пищу для размышлений от наших спикеров, еще раз повторюсь, блестящих спикеров. И в заключение я хочу сказать, что говоря о уроках и факторах успеха, мы сегодня утром говорили о том, что мы избегали формализации. Достаточно сказать, что таких формальных встреч управляющего комитета, консультативного совета, редакционных коллег у нас практически не бывает, потому что люди живут в разных странах. Это больше онлайн-обсуждения, разовые обсуждения. И мы корректируем здесь в сотрудничестве с правительством Казахстана и с UNDP наши действия. Но за 5 лет с момента создания управляющего комитета многие должностные лица уже поменяли свою работу. И в этой связи я хочу сейчас представить вам обновленный состав управляющего комитета Хаба после консультации с правительством Казахстана, с UNDP, с нашими активными участниками. Получается такая композиция, уже персонифицированная, которая и была, но уже новые персоны заняли эти должности за это время. Ағылшыншасын қойыңдар. Вы в таком виде, да? Ну, Наримаса Шимамура, которого вы знаете, президент representative, Алекс Шпекбаев, председатель агентства, Катерин Кардава, профессор Пансу Ким, мистер Эдвин Лау из ОСР, профессор Билл Шилдс из АСПА, ректор Кыргызской академии Алмаз Насыров и дуаен дипломатического корпуса в Астане господин Ничкасов. То есть просто поменялись люди, которые занимали эти должности. Мы просто хотим, чтобы вы были осведомлены, что вот если у вас нет категорических возражений по кому-либо из них, то мы в этом составе, с вашего позволения, продолжим работать. Но по сути, стиринг комитет у нас тоже похож на консультативный совет, потому что он не занимается операционным менеджментом, больше определяет стратегические приоритеты. В то же время тактические приоритеты, ежегодные приоритеты, мы больше прислушиваемся к советам членов консультативного совета. И я хочу сказать, что сейчас у нас из старого состава консультативного совета, который определен был год назад, присутствует Майя Адвалишвили, Рекс Фейсер, Ернар Жаркешев, Шолпан Исимова. И мы сегодня разговаривали с Яхья о членстве в этом консультативном совете. На самом деле консультативный совет достаточно открытый, и если у вас есть кого предложить в состав консультативного совета, задача заключается в том, чтобы определить спрос. У нас есть needs assessment survey, да? У нас есть спрос в конкретном виде, допустим, комиссия по госслужбе Азербайджана нам говорит, вот нам нужно проводить такое мероприятие, либо такое исследование. Но кроме этого, иногда мы прибегаем к вашим консультациям для того, чтобы уточнить, правильно ли мы идем. И в этой связи состав этого совета открыт, и я прошу вот завтра до конца конференции, если есть предложения какие-то, дать, и чтобы мы могли обмениваться оперативной информацией. И аппарат хаба будет вам рассылать всю информацию, необходимую для того, чтобы вы могли периодически советовать нам, что делать. И, наконец, что касается редакционной коллегии, то здесь присутствует чиф-редактор Panos Liverakos, и мы имеем хороший состав сейчас редакционной коллегии. Но также, если есть какие-то предложения, которые достойны внимания, то Панос внесет и для того, чтобы мы рассмотрели возможность изменения этого состава. Ну и я понимаю, что на самом деле сегодня мы плотно поработали, но хаб имеет свои традиции. Сегодня, вы знаете, 8 часов ужин на 23-м этаже. Одна из традиций хаба, что каждый из нас должен быть готов спеть песню. Желательно свою национальную, либо интернациональную, что на самом деле сближает, наверное, нас. И поэтому smart casual, галстук не обязателен. Мануэл Эдуардович, он уже давно участвует, он сразу кивает. И поэтому вот 8 часов с живым ансамблем, либо караоке, будьте готовы. А для тех, кто держит уразу, Рамадан, то 9:30 снова будет накрыт, там чуть выше есть, да, на том же этаже, но есть там типа балкона, террасы, мы там для них накроем отдельно. Поэтому, если какие-то претензии, комментарии к модератору, я имею в виду. Если нет, в 8 часов начинаем. Кстати, у нас уже 3 гитариста. Да, Ираклий, вот, Орхидея. Мы уже нашли гитару для вас. Если у кого есть пожелания по инструментам, ну, рояль туда затащить сложно будет, но все остальное мы можем. Так что, если нет возражений, вопросов, предложений, то я еще раз благодарю. Завтра у нас сессии целый день совместно с South Network будет. Большое спасибо нашим работникам. Большое вам спасибо.